Welcome everyone. I'm Carlos Carbonell, illustrator and digital artist. This is a full painting tutorial for painting landscapes with watercolor in Rebelle 7. It is a very long video. It's divided by chapters. You can access them clicking on timestamps, available in the video description or in the video navigation bar. I use the Pro version, especially the pigments option, but for watercolors sometimes it's better to not use it. You can achieve almost the same results when using watercolors when using the standard version. But for oils export at higher sizes and fine tweaking of your artwork, the Pro version may be very useful. You can also use any version of Rebelle, like 5 or 6. The techniques I use in this tutorial are the same for all versions. I will paint a quick landscape. It took me around 70 minutes from start to finish. It's easy enough and effective. It's a good practice for anyone. I used a reference made up to 2 photos. The hills and the tree are from a stock photography I purchased time ago. It's from New Zealand. The distant mountains and sky are from a photo I took few days ago in a pretty cold day. These are mountains from Catalonia, Spain. As a curiosity, New Zealand and Catalonia, they are almost at the antipodes. This is a good example on how to search for good references. It's a good idea to make your own compositions using different sources. Just take caution to no put tropical palms in the middle of alpine mountains. We start creating our canvas. For watercolors, isn't recommended to use high sizes, because Rebelle will struggle. With the Pro version, you can always resize at any size without losing detail or looking blurred. I selected the size of 3080 by 2500 pixels, at 300 dpi. For the paper, I used a canaf paper. For landscape painting, it's a good idea to use rough textured papers. The color is set at default, it's almost white. I always test some brushes, to see how watercolors behave with the paper. I open the visual settings and toggle off granulation and drips. I also check the texture influence setting. Finally, I set the diffusion speed at maximum value. It looks pretty good for me. I clean the canvas, pressing the delete key. I import my reference. Open the References panel. Click on Import icon and select the reference. Click on the thumbnail. This will open a new window with your reference. You can close the main References panel. Place the reference in the place you wish. I always use the top left corner of the canvas. I also open the Preview panel. It's always a good idea having a thumbnail of your artwork. This helps to see the values and contrast of your painting. A successful landscape must be good at these values. Place all your elements and panels on your screen. You need to feel comfortable with your interface. A good start is important, so you can be more focused on your painting instead of your interface. We start doing the sketch. Select the pencil tool. You can choose any other tool if you wish. For landscapes, I always create a straight horizontal line. This is very helpful as starting point. The rest of the sketch can be rough. You don't need to be very precise. In landscapes, it's good to have imperfections and differences from your reference. Don't add details in this step. We just need to define the areas and elements. I don't like to define the exact positions and shapes. For the mountains, I just sketch a mountain in that place, not the exact mountain I see in the reference, especially on distant mountains. I tweak a little the placement, stretching the entire sketch vertically. I also use the liquify tool to tweak a little the shapes. Liquify is a nice tool, maybe not at this stage, but it's very useful for portrait paintings and final tweaks. Remember to save your progress. I start the painting itself. As with traditional media, I start using the wet-on-wet technique, adapted to Rebelle. Wet-on-wet consists of filling the paper with clean water, then paint using a very wet brush. This makes smooth transitions and nice color blending. Wet-on-wet in Rebelle is different from traditional watercolor. I will show you the best approach. First, we open the visual settings. Set TE rewet value at minimum. Otherwise, any brush stroke will wipe the other colors, in addition to make harder to blend colors naturally. Set texture influence at 5 or less than 5. Set the canvas tilt to 0 by clicking on the central knot. You can add a small amount of tilt, but not so much. Make sure drip and grain are disabled. The trick of wet-on-wet in Rebelle is that you must have the water spread evenly on your canvas, all the time. The best brush for wet-on-wet is the mop brush, on Watercolor Group. Select this brush, and reset it to default values, by clicking on the icon in Properties panel. You can make it bigger by clicking on Brush Creator panel, go to Stroke category, and set maximum brush size to its maximum value. Save the brush preset. Wet the layer by clicking the icon in Layers panel. You can do the same by pressing Shift-L. Remember that shortcut, you will use it very often during wet-on-wet process. You can start painting. Apply gentle brush strokes. You need to wet the layer very often, to make the pigment spread evenly. The more you this, the best. Remember to press Shift-L very few brush strokes. For the colors, I don't recommend picking the color in Reference panel. You can do it, but trying to select the right color by yourself will make you understand better the colors. I'm using a custom color set. You can use any other color set or the color wheel. Don't worry about precision, we can always tweak anything easily by paint over. At this stage, I'm only worried about values. I try to paint the area of the mountains at very low values in gray or near to gray tones. As mountains get closer, I use a slightly darker tone. I start adding a little of color on the sky and the middle distance. At this stage is better to deactivate the pigments feature, because it produces too vibrant color blending. It's better to start with muddy colors, and adding the more vibrant colors later. For the fields, I use an olive green. For the foreground, I use the same color a little darker, and covering with more pigment. I start defining the colors. I do this from far to near areas, starting with the sky. I don't really care about the exact color. I just want to have the right value and tone. For the distant mountains, I start using the same sky color, just a little darker and a little grayish. I do the same on each mountain range that is closer, making a little darker each time. I start painting the fields and foreground areas with a dark green olive, making more intense as we approach the foreground. In these areas I will try to paint more dark than it needs. I will paint over later on, with the right colors. This is not real watercolors, we can paint from dark to light if we wish. Remember that we are still making wet-on-wet. If you forget to wet the layer, you may get uneven color mix. If that's the case, you can use the same brush in blending mode, by pressing 4. Press 1 or 2 to get back to painting mode. I start to define the sky gradient, painting with light blue. Don't make the sky gradient too strong, it will look unnatural if you do it. I like to duplicate the layer 2 or 3 times, to make the color stronger. Then I merge the layers. Even at this early stage, you can see we have the feel of distance, and the areas are being defined. This means we are going good. I keep going until I'm satisfied. At this point, I only look for the right values and the feel of distance. When you finish, press the Dry Layer button in Layers pane, or by pressing Shift-D, remember that shortcut. From now, I will use Shift-D very often. And this is it for wet on wet. From now on I will use the wet on dry technique until the end. The wet on dry technique means we are painting over a dry area. If we keep painting, the pigment will spread only with the brush strokes we did since the last time we dried the layer. So, if you are satisfied with the current painting, press Shift-D to dry the layer. This will avoid unwanted color mixing and a lot of problems when you paint with Rebelle. This may be the most used shortcut when you use Rebelle watercolor. You don't need to use it very often, but don't forget to dry to avoid problems. You may want this kind of problems, or happy accidents. But this isn't the case for this tutorial. So, remember to press Shift-D. From now on, I will not tell each time I press Shift-D, because I used it so many times during the painting. We start to paint with wet on dry. Now we can paint directly with the colors that we want, or the ones that feel right for our artwork. It's time to press the Pigments button on Layers panel. We will get vibrant blending, matching the real media color blending. If you don't have the Pro version, you will not have that option. But don't worry, you can still achieve nice colors with Rebelle watercolors. I start adding color to foreground. I use very saturated colors here. If you use unsaturated colors in the background and saturated in the foreground, you will get a nice contrast. I use brushes that are affected by the paper grain. This helps to add detail. For example, in foreground hills, it looks like grass, or ground features. Even without painting any grass, it adds the feel of grass. An easy way to know which watercolors brushes are affected with paper grain, search for brushes with the word dry on the name. I can also like to use a little of canvas tilt. This creates smooth color gradients. Remember that we set the rewet setting to minimum. Otherwise, our brush strokes will wipe the background color. If rewet is set at its default value of 5, it will be good. The hills are starting looking good. Remember to dry the layer if you need it. You can use the blender tool if you wish. This tool is nice for the sky. But for the ground, I think it's better you use the same brush as blender, by pressing 4. Press 1 or 2 to paint again. I try to differentiate the left hill by adding more warm tones. This helps to make it look closer to us. I start painting the middle distance fields. To avoid problems, I create a new layer and paint here. I use more cold and grayish tones than foreground, to create the feel of distance. As I'm working on a new layer, I can use any eraser to create details, revealing the background color. You can use the eraser tool. But like blenders, in watercolors is best to use the same brush in eraser mode, by pressing 5. Press 1 or 2 to paint again. The color looks too bright for me. I use the hue saturation filter. I lowered the saturation value to make the colors less vibrant. I like how it looks. The feel of distance seems good. I could leave the distant mountains as they are, but I decided to add more definition. I will paint only the edges. I don't want to add details. Adding details to distant areas on your painting is a bad idea. The details must go on the main subject of your painting. If you add details everywhere, all zones of your painting will compete for the viewer attention. The main subject of this artwork will be the hills and the tree, so I will use most of the details in these areas. I pick the colors from the painting and keep painting the edges. As I did with fields, I paint on a new layer. I will merge the layer when I finish. This is it for the mountains. It's not a lot of work, but they look pretty good in my opinion. In this case, it's better to stop and not overdo it. In case you need to add more details, it's better to wait until last stages of the painting. Remember to save your progress. It's time to add more features to the artwork. I start with foreground. I use a warm yellow to add more volume to the hills. At the same time, I'm tweaking the edges to look more like grass. As we add more details, we must use Shift-D more often to dry the layer. I add a little of color to the middle distance using gentle brush strokes. As before, I'm using a new layer that I will merge when I finish. I add a little of orange to the middle distance to add more variety. This adds the feel of details and features without painting any detail. I keep adding volume to the foreground zone. I put some highlights. They are not so bright, but add a lot of volume and interest to the artwork. When I merge the layer, the pigment's deactivated by itself. This is Rebelle behavior when you merge a pigmented layer with another without pigments. Just press the pigments button to use pigments again. I paint again over the middle distance section. At this point, I try to paint with the right colors. Sometimes I like to jump and paint in another area. When this happens, you know that your painting is going well, and you start to refine your artwork. I'm gonna paint the tree. First, I paint the trunk and the branches on a new layer. I use the brush knife dry. You can copy this brush from oil brushes. Select the brush and press Ctrl-C on PC or Command-C on Mac. Go to your watercolor category. Select a group and press Ctrl-V on PC or Command-V on Mac. This will copy the brush in your selected group. If you like any brush, you can use this trick to copy it in another category. For example, the brush knife dry, it's pretty good for watercolor, because in one side is not affected by paper texture, but it is in the other side. This mimics real watercolor pencils that are almost dry. I paint the trunks with a very dark color. I keep adding branches and tweaking the trunk size. the tree trunks and branches sizes are always wide at the bottom to thin at the top. It may seem pretty obvious, but if don't pay attention, it's easy to paint branches too wide at the top. Keep adding many branches as you wish. I recommend adding as much as possible, it adds realism to any painting. Another way to add realism when you paint trees is to avoid making the trunk straight. Instead, it's a good idea to rotate a little the trunk. If it has different trunks, which is the case, rotate each trunk in different directions. Now I'm gonna paint the most important thing on this painting, the main subject, the leaves. Many people struggle painting leaves, they cover too much area with the leaves, or use splatter brushes with leaf shapes, which look too digital. Some people try to paint all the leaves individually, which is a bad idea, unless you are looking for hyper-realism. Instead of doing that, I will use the new Rebelle 7 feature, the structures. This feature adds an extra texture to your canvas. You can place, rotate, scale, flip and invert the structure. This adds a lot of customization. Any brush that is affected by paper texture will be also affected by structures, in the same way. I will use this feature to paint the leaves. Open the Structures panel. Open the Structures library clicking on the Library button of that panel. Select the structure you wish. I create a new layer to paint the leaves, and I select a dark green. When you paint green zones in your landscape, don't use bright or saturated green colors. Instead, use olive or khaki greens. Select a yellow color and go to black in the color wheel, this will choose a khaki color. I make some brush strokes to test the structure, and edit it if necessary. When I'm happy, I start painting. If you use lower pressure with your stylus, it will create the texture. If you use strong pressure, it will cover everything. I inverted the structure to create less texture. But I wasn't happy with that, so I inverted again the structure. If you open the visual settings, and change texture influence to higher value, it will also add more texturing, because the pigment will go to the darker areas of the texture. The same applies to paper texture. If you use tilt, it will add even more texture. At this point I changed the structure. I use one created by myself. Changing structures add more texture variation. When you paint leaves, don't cover everything with paint. Always leave some areas unpainted. Otherwise it will look like a big pile of green things, instead of leaves. For distant trees may be okay. But for near trees like this one, you must paint the leaves to look as realistic as possible, leaving zones unpainted. I start to add dimension to the leaves. First I must know from which direction comes the light. It comes from the top right corner, so I paint with a lighter green in these areas of the tree. I used an olive color. Don't use a saturated green, it will look unrealistic. I add a little bit of highlights with a light orange color. This structure may serve also for painting the light areas on the trunks, with an orange color. I don't paint this so much, just a little bit. Now we have a happy tree. Technically speaking, a tree isn't happy without another tree. But I already painted some bushes, which also produce happiness. It's time to stop adding features to the artwork. From now on, I will avoid adding more complexity to the scene. I will polish the scene. First I decided to add a little of texture to the distance mountains. I select the structure with a rocky texture, you may choose any other with a very different texture. The results will be almost the same. I add tiny bits of lighter areas, to add more volume. Don't use a color too much different from the one of your mountains, you need to avoid any high contrast. Remember that isn't a good idea to add too much detail everywhere. You may notice I added the light differently to the reference. The light comes from the top right corner. As I did with leaves, I avoid making an exact reference copy, or painting each feature of the mountains. In this case, I only want to add the feel of distant mountains. I blend a little all these mountain details, to look it blurry. This is similar to the concept of sfumato popularized by Leonardo da Vinci. This means that, at more distance, more blurred must be the edges of your painting. This enhances the feel of depth. I add more bushes on the hill, because the tree seems to not be happy enough. Jokes aside, I added the bushes because this zone seemed to lack something. By the way, thanks Bob Ross teaching that any one of us can be a painter. I paint some light areas to all these bushes, to give them more volume. But not so much, I don't need too much details here. I blend a little these bushes to avoid contrast. I want the main contrast to be only in the tree. At this moment I thought that this artwork needs more contrast. I make sure that everything but the tree is merged in only one layer. I open the filter levels and check the button auto levels. This feature makes sure that there's pure black and pure white on your image, adjusting everything else. It's an easy first step to make color adjustments in your artwork. Sometimes it's enough with this little step. Sometimes don't. It looks good to me. But I finally did this duplicating the layer, so I always can revert to early stage, or make this effect not so strong. I see that there's an area on the sky too much bright. I solve this just by painting over and blending that zone if necessary. I lowered the opacity of the top layer, to make the effect less strong. Now it's time for the clouds. I will paint them on a new layer. I paint big bush strokes, I don't need precision. To add more details, I used a structure, because this will add some texture that may serve as little clouds or more irregular edges on the big clouds. I start blending the edges. Ideally, you must blend all edges but the ones that are affected by the light. I add the volume by painting the shadowed areas of the clouds. You need to avoid too dark colors. A trick is to pick the color from the mountains. This ensures you are using the right values. I block the layer transparency, to avoid painting outside the clouds. Keep painting, blending and erasing until you are satisfied. I created a new layer and I clipped it to the clouds layer. This way I will only paint over the clouds area, but on a new area. I changed the layer blending mode to overlay. This mode adds contrast. In order to use layer blending modes, you must make sure that pigment's feature is off. I paint with a light gray, this makes the light areas look more bright. When I finish, I merge these two layers. I did an auto levels test with the tree. In this case, it was worse than original tree, so finally I didn't use it. We are at the final stage of this artwork. I will add the final details and touches. At this point you must be careful to not add too much detail or to not overdo anything. I add some shadows by painting on a new layer with layer blend mode multiply. I add more light on a new layer. But this time, I use the layer blend mode lighten. On distant areas I use darker colors. I don't want too much light here. In near zones, I use a brighter color, almost white. I create a new layer in normal blending mode. I will add the details here. I used a rake brush that I copied from oils category. I will use it to paint some grass. Don't paint grass everywhere, just a little bit. It's very easy to overdo the grass areas. Take caution, don't paint too much grass. You can use any brush that stamps grass images, but don't use it too often. The grass must look uneven, not like a repeated pattern. I add some details in the middle distance. Just some spots of paint that look like distant trees. This will make it look more detailed than it really is, so don't overdo it. You can keep tweaking things and painting more and more. But on my opinion, I guess I'm finished. Remember to always sign your artworks and save your artwork. This is a very simple painting. But maybe I forgot to explain anything, or I did it too fast. Please stop the video at any moment or play it at lower speed. You can add any question on the comments section. This tutorial lacks any comment about watercolor opacity modes. I wanted to do it, but I forgot to use transparent and opaque modes. In addition, this video is already too long. Maybe in a next lesson. I hope you like this tutorial. If this is the case, please subscribe to my channel. Be happy and see you in the next video.